He came back to England in the second week of October, when the light over the northern counties had already thinned to something grey and cautious, and the roads out of Derbyshire were soft with the last of the autumn rains. He had not sent word ahead. There had been a telegram dispatched from Dover and another from Nottingham, but both had apparently outrun the household's ability to act on them, because when his carriage turned through the gates of Caldwell Park at 6:30 in the evening, there was no groom at the steps and no lamp carried out to meet him. The house itself was lit. That was the first thing. Every window on the ground floor glowed with candlelight, and the effect from the drive, through the bare elms, was almost warm. Almost. Edward Hartley, Viscount Caldwell, climbed down from the carriage himself, his left shoulder aching in the way it had ached since Vienna, and stood for a moment in the gravel drive with the rain still spattering the shoulders of his coat, looking up at the windows of a house he had not seen in 18 months. He let himself in through the side entrance with the key he had carried in his waistcoat pocket, across 4 countries and a channel. The hall was empty. From the dining room down the passage, he heard the low sound of a chair being drawn back, the clink of a glass set on a table, and then nothing. He walked toward the sound. The dining room door was open. The table had been set for one, and the candles were burning at the far end near the window, and there was a woman sitting at his place, at the head of his table, with a bread roll in one hand and a book propped open against the water jug. And she was reading. She looked up when his shadow crossed the doorway. He looked at her. She did not scramble to her feet. She did not knock the book over. She set the bread roll down on the plate and folded the book closed with the measured composure of someone who had decided, in the half-second available to her, that panic was not useful. Her face was pale in the candlelight, and her eyes were direct, and she said in a voice that was perfectly level, "Lord Caldwell, welcome home." He said nothing. The fire crackled in the grate. Somewhere above them, in the upper part of the house, a floorboard creaked and settled. The Viscount stood in his own dining room doorway looking at a woman he had never seen in his life, and he thought, with the particular clarity that comes to a man who has had 18 months to stop expecting things to be as he left them. Of course. Her name was Cecily Vane, and she had not expected to survive this long. That was not a dramatic statement. It was simply the calculation she had been running since March, when her father, the Reverend George Vane of Ashford-in-the-Water, had died of a fever that took 3 weeks, and asked nothing of him except his life. He had been 54 years old, and had always seemed younger. He had read to her every evening from whatever had arrived in the post, and had considered this the most natural form of instruction available. She had considered it the same. The entail passed the rectory, and what small living her father held to her brother Charles, who was 26, and had been trying earnestly and without particular success to become a solicitor in Derby. Charles loved her. Charles was sorry. Charles had approximately nothing to give her except his sorrow, and a woman of 23 cannot keep herself in bread on the currency of her brother's sorrow, however genuine. She had looked at the figures for 3 days after the funeral, and the figures had confirmed what she had already suspected. She needed a position, and she needed one before the summer. Lady Paxton's letter arrived in early May. Lady Paxton was the aunt of a viscount presently abroad, whose household required a responsible young woman of good family and sound character to serve as companion and supervisor to the viscount's ward, a boy of 6 recently come to Caldwell Park under unhappy circumstances. The position carried a modest salary and a furnished room and access to the household's table, and it would terminate at such time as the Viscount himself determined. Cecily had read this letter 3 times, folded it, put it in her apron pocket, and read it a 4th time before supper. She had written back the following morning. She arrived at Caldwell Park on the 17th of May to find a house that ran efficiently and grieved quietly and spoke of the late Mr. James Hartley, younger brother to the Viscount, only in the past tense, and only when asked. The servants had the particular quietness of people who had absorbed a loss and were still carrying it at the back of their daily work. Mrs. Gould, the housekeeper, had met Cecily at the door with the kind of measured warmth that meant she was reserving judgment and would take several weeks to form it. Mr. Ashworth, the steward, had given Cecily a tour of the nursery quarters with the efficiency of a man who was glad to have the matter settled and preferred not to examine it too closely. The boy, Thomas, was 6½ and had his father's eyes, and in the first week he had said almost nothing to her at all. She had not forced him. She had simply appeared each morning at the nursery door with his breakfast on a tray and set it down and sat nearby with whatever book she was reading, and she had not required conversation from him. She had read aloud sometimes, without directing it at him specifically. He had listened from behind a chair for the first 3 days, and then gradually migrated, over the course of the following week, to the chair itself, and then to a footstool close enough that she could see the dust on the toes of his boots. By the 3rd week, he had begun to bring her things, small objects, mostly from the garden, a smooth gray stone, the wing of a moth he had found on the window ledge. Once he had brought her a snail in his cap, and she had taken this very seriously, and they had examined it together, and then released it near the kitchen garden wall. By the end of June, he had begun to sleep through the night. She had been at Caldwell 4 months when word came that Lord Caldwell was expected. The word arrived through Mr. Ashworth, who delivered it without particular emotion, and then asked whether she had any questions. She had said no. She had gone upstairs and sat on the edge of her bed and looked at the wall for 10 minutes, calculating, and the calculation had arrived at the same place each time. A man returning to his own house had every right to rearrange whatever he found there. She was part of what he would find. She had begun, quietly and without drama, to consider where she might go next. That had been 3 weeks ago. And then the Viscount had appeared in the doorway like something the night had set down without warning, travel-worn and rain-damp, and clearly not a man who had sent telegrams expecting them to be acted upon, and he had looked at her across the dining room with the expression of a person confronted with a detail that did not fit any map he currently carried. She had given him the only greeting available to her. He had said nothing. He said very little, in fact, for the remainder of that first evening. Mrs. Gould appeared from somewhere behind him and murmured apologies for the lack of a proper welcome and ordered a second setting placed. The Viscount sat down at the other end of the table, which was a long way from Cecily's end, and ate with the focused efficiency of a man who had been traveling for 3 days and required fuel rather than pleasure. And he did not look at her again. She was aware of not being looked at in the way one is aware of a sound that has stopped. She excused herself at 7:30, when the meal was done, and went upstairs, and lay in her bed, listening to the house settle around its returned owner, and told herself that she had survived worse uncertainties than this one. She almost believed it. The morning after, she brought Thomas down to breakfast at 8. She had considered not doing so. She had considered sending Mrs. Gould, or simply allowing Thomas his breakfast upstairs, as he sometimes had on cold mornings. The consideration had lasted until Thomas himself had knocked on her door in his stocking feet, asking whether the man who had come in the night was truly the uncle who sent things from abroad. Because if so, he would like to bring his collection of stones to show him. And she had said, as steadily as she could, that he might have that opportunity in time. She had not been able to decide, afterward, whether bringing him down to breakfast was an act of sense or of cowardice. The Viscount was at the breakfast table with a letter open in front of him and a cup of coffee held in both hands in the manner of a man who needed the warmth of it more than the substance. He looked up when she came in. He looked at Thomas. Thomas stood in the doorway of the breakfast room and looked back at his uncle with the grave assessment of a child who had been told, carefully and in general terms, that there was a relation somewhere who had been away and would someday come back. The resemblance was not subtle. Thomas had his father's face in the way that sometimes happened between brothers. The same line of brow, the same serious set of the mouth, and the Viscount went very still looking at it. He set the coffee cup down on the table. He said, his voice carefully level. "Good morning," Thomas said. "Good morning, sir. You are Thomas?" "Yes, sir." "I am your Uncle Edward." Thomas considered this for a moment. Then he said, with the directness that Cecily had come to understand was simply his native register, "Are you going to stay?" The Viscount looked at his brother's child, and something moved behind his eyes that Cecily could not name, and did not try to. "Yes," he said. "I am going to stay." She watched him understand that he had not known to say that before. She watched him understand, in the same moment, that the boy needed to hear it. She had not left the room when perhaps she should have, and so she witnessed both the question and the answer. And she filed them away in the careful internal ledger where she kept the things that mattered in this house. He asked her to return at 10. She did. He was in the library, standing at the window overlooking the south garden, which was brown and tidy under the October sky. He did not turn when she came in. He said, without preamble, "My aunt arranged your position here." "She did, my lord." "Mr. Ashworth confirmed the terms this morning. You receive £12 per annum, your room and your board." "That is correct." Thomas appears settled. "He has had a difficult year." She paused. "He is a child of steady character." He turned from the window then, and she saw him clearly for the first time in good light. He was 31 years old, and 18 months abroad had done something to the angles of his face that indoor England had not fully smoothed. There was a scar at his left jaw, not dramatic. A thin pale line that ran an inch below the ear and curved slightly forward. The kind of scar a man earns and then stops explaining. His eyes were gray, darker toward the pupil, and they were currently directed at her with an attention that was not unfriendly and not warm, and gave her very little information about what lay behind it. "My aunt will call this morning," he said. "She will likely characterize your position here in terms I may not have used myself. I want you to understand that your position here is not under review." She said carefully, "I appreciate that, my lord. I am not reassuring you. I am informing you. There is a difference." She said, "I understand the difference." He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he said, "Thomas will need someone consistent. He has had enough of things changing." He turned back to the window, which she understood to be a dismissal. "That is all." "Yes, my lord," she said, and went. Lady Paxton arrived at 11. She was the Viscount's mother's sister, 60 years old. Handsome in the way of a woman who has decided to remain so by act of will. And she managed the drawing-room of Caldwell Park in the Viscount's absence with the air of a person who has been asked to tend a garden and has instead decided to redesign it. She embraced her nephew with the warmth of genuine relief, and then looked past his shoulder at Cecily, who was standing near the door with Thomas's morning coat over her arm. "You have met Miss Vane," Lady Paxton said. Her tone was pleasant. It was also the tone a person uses when they have decided the subject under discussion is already resolved. "I have," the Viscount said. "She has been very adequate with the boy." Lady Paxton turned to Cecily with a smile that reached the level of her cheekbones and stopped. "You may go, Miss Vane. Thomas will not need his coat this morning." Cecily said, "Yes, my lady," and began to withdraw. Lady Paxton turned back to her nephew and said in the lowered voice of someone who has made a calculation about who is and is not in earshot, "She is a charity case from Derbyshire, Edward, a rector's daughter with no connections, useful for the present, naturally. One does not wish to be ungrateful for what she has managed. The boy seems calmer, and the nursery is in order. Still, now that you are home, we shall want to think carefully about what Thomas requires in a more permanent arrangement." Cecily was at the door. She kept her pace even. She did not let any of it show in the line of her shoulders or the set of her hands, because she had learned, before coming to Caldwell, that the face one shows to the back of a room is just as important as the face one shows to the front of it. She went upstairs and told Thomas his coat was not required and read him a chapter of his current book, and she was steady the entire time. 3 days passed. On the 4th evening, she put Thomas to bed at 7 and then returned to the nursery at 8 when he could not sleep. And she read to him for another half-hour, and he fell asleep in the low armchair beside the fire, with his thumb almost at his mouth, in the way he had outgrown and returned to at intervals since his father died. She tucked the blanket over him. In his right hand, curled loosely in sleep, was the small carved wooden horse, pale and smooth, that she had commissioned from the village carpenter in July, when Thomas had woken screaming for 3 nights running, and she had thought simply that he needed something to hold. The carpenter had made it from apple wood, rounded at the edges. Simple. The kind of thing a hand could grip without catching on anything sharp. She sat down on the stool by the fire and looked at the boy sleeping, and the fire burning down and the rain beginning again outside the window. And after a while she did what she sometimes did when the house was quiet, and she was tired and needed something other than the sound of her own thinking. And she went to the small pianoforte in the corner of the nursery, which was out of tune in 2 keys, but otherwise serviceable. And she played. She played softly. The piece she knew best, a slow air her father had loved, in a key that asked very little of the instrument and received something close to what it promised. It was a pastoral thing, unhurried, the kind of melody that does not build to any destination, but simply continues until it is done. She did not hear the door. She did not hear anything. She played for perhaps 8 minutes. And when she stopped, it was because the boy had shifted in his sleep, and she did not want to wake him. Not because the room had changed. She did not know until the following morning that the door to the nursery had stood open for the last 4 minutes of the piece, and that the Viscount had been in the doorway, and that he had not moved or spoken, and had not, when the music stopped, made himself known. She did not know any of this. She banked the fire and went to bed. He did not sleep. He walked the length of the east corridor 3 times in the dark, and then he went to his brother's study, which no one had touched since James died. And he sat in James's chair with James's pen on the blotter in front of him, and listened to the house settle around him. The room still smelled faintly of his brother's tobacco, that particular light Virginia blend, and the smell was so specific and so unexpected that he had to sit very still for a moment before he could think clearly. He had failed James. That was not a thought he dramatized or examined carefully. It was simply present, the way a stone is present in the bottom of a boot, felt with every step. He had been in Vienna when James took ill. The letters had been slow, the dispatches slower. The news that his brother was dead had arrived in Bath 2 months after the fact, delivered by a man from the Foreign Office who had looked at the floor while he read from a sheet of paper. The Viscount had sat in the chair of his Bath lodgings and had looked at the window for a period of time he could not afterward account for. He had come home to set things right, which was the only form of action available to a man who could not go back. He had not known about Thomas. That was the part that undid him in a way the rest of it had not. His brother had a son, and the son had been in this house for months. And Edward had been in Bath trying to recover the use of his left shoulder and listening to other people's music. There was a boy in the armchair upstairs with a horse carved from applewood in his sleeping hand, and a woman who had stayed when she had no reason to expect anything from staying, and the house was lit and warm in a way it had apparently been all autumn, and he sat in his dead brother's chair and counted the cost of having been away. In the morning, he went to find Cecily Vane and asked her to come with him to James's study. He showed her the letters. Not all of them. Only the pile that Mr. Ashworth had left sorted by date on the desk, the correspondence that had arrived after the Viscount departed for Vienna and had therefore not reached him at all. He stood before them and said, without looking at them, and without any particular inflection in his voice, "I did not know he was ill." She stood beside him at the desk and looked at the pile of letters. She did not say she was sorry, which he was grateful for, because he was tired of being sorry for. And she did not look at him with the careful, neutral compassion that people deployed when they wanted to help and did not know how. She said after a moment, "He did not suffer long. Mr. Ashworth told me it was a matter of 10 days. 10 days, he repeated. He was well until he was not. I think from what Mrs. Gould has said, that he was himself until quite near the end." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Thomas, in the first weeks, was he frightened?" She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Yes, he was very quiet, which was frightening in a child who is naturally not quiet. He asked for his father twice in the first week. After that, he stopped asking. The Viscount looked at the edge of the desk. "He did not stop grieving," Cecily said, because she wanted to be accurate. "He simply stopped expecting the answer. There is a difference." He looked at her then, and she held the look without flinching. Outside the study window, the park lay flat and gray under an overcast sky, the grass still wet from the previous night's rain. "You played for him," he said. "In the evenings." "When it helped, yes." "Did it help often?" "Often enough," she said. "He would fall asleep." Children are more honest than adults about what comforts them. They reach for the thing that works, rather than for the thing that seems correct. He was quiet for a long moment. She could see him turning something over. Slowly. The way a man turns something that has sharp edges and requires care. Then he said, "The horse. The carved one he carries. I had it made in July. He was waking at night. He showed it to me this morning." He paused. "He said you chose the wood. The carpenter gave me the choice. Applewood holds better than pine for something small, and it has a pleasant smell." He looked at her steadily for a moment. That was slightly longer than necessary. Then he turned and went to the door, and she stayed where she was among his brother's things, and she heard his footstep go quiet down the corridor. Mrs. Gould told her afterward, in the kitchen, that she had seen the Viscount standing in the nursery doorway at 7 the following morning, just standing there in the corridor looking at the boy asleep for 4 or 5 minutes, until Thomas stirred and he walked away before the child could see him. Cecily thought about that for a long time. If you have stayed with this story so far, you already understand something that Cecily herself was only beginning to suspect. A man can stand in a doorway for 4 minutes and not move and tell you everything you need to know. Stay with her a little longer. Lady Paxton moved quickly. The invitation to Miss Dorothea Fearn and her mother, Mrs. Fearn, was issued before the end of the second week, framed as a neighborly visit and scheduled to last 5 days. Dorothea Fearn was 21. and had the polished surface of a woman who had been prepared for a specific outcome her entire life. She was not unkind. She was simply correct. In the way that a well-made instrument is correct, every part in its place, the whole designed for a specific purpose. Lady Paxton placed her in the Viscount's vicinity with the confidence of a gardener who has prepared the soil and now requires only time and favorable weather. The Ashbourne County dinner fell on the third day of Dorothea's visit. Cecily did not attend. She was not invited. She stayed at Caldwell with Thomas and Mrs. Gould, and she read and sewed and told herself that the evening's arrangements were none of her concern, which was true. She put Thomas to bed at 7 and sat by the nursery fire with her mending and listened to the rain on the window and did not think about anything in particular. It was Mrs. Gould who told her the next morning, setting a cup of tea on the breakfast table with an expression that suggested she was about to say something she felt should be said, that at the county dinner Miss Fearn had been heard to say, in the hearing of 3 people at the Ashbourne table, that Caldwell Park kept a charity case from Derbyshire in the nursery, and wasn't it touching that the Viscount had not yet sorted it out? Mrs. Gould said she thought Cecily should know. Mrs. Gould said it in the tone of someone who is angry on another person's behalf and has decided that anger is best expressed through information. Cecily looked at her tea. She said, "Thank you, Mrs. Gould." She finished her breakfast. She went upstairs to her room and sat at the small writing desk by the window and took out a sheet of paper. She sat with the paper in front of her for 10 minutes. She thought about the morning she had arrived at Caldwell, the house quiet and the boy silent in the nursery doorway. She thought about the stone and the moth wing and the snail in the cap, and the pianoforte out of tune in 2 keys, and Thomas's hand on the carved horse in the firelight. She thought about what it cost to choose correctly when the correct thing was not the comfortable thing. Then she began to write. She wrote carefully and without self-pity. She informed Lord Caldwell that she wished to give 4 weeks' notice, effective from the date of the letter, and that she was grateful for the position and would ensure a thorough handover to whoever was engaged in her place. She said that Thomas was a child of good character and warm heart, and that she was confident he would attach himself well to a new companion if she were chosen with care. She said she hoped the transition would not be difficult for the boy. She folded the letter and addressed it, and left it on the hall table with the morning's post. That night, at 11:30, there was a sound in the corridor outside her room. She was not asleep. She was sitting up in bed with her book not quite reading, which had been her state for approximately 2 hours, and when she heard the footstep, and then the quiet voice she recognized as the Viscount's, she set the book down and went to the door. He was not at her door. He was at the far end of the corridor, near the door to the nursery stairs, and he was talking in the low tone of a man trying not to frighten a child. And after a moment, Cecily understood that Thomas was standing in the corridor in his nightshirt, with the carved horse held tight in both hands and his feet bare on the cold floor. She heard Thomas say, "I heard talking, and I thought someone was going away." She heard the Viscount say, "No one is going anywhere. Come." She heard Thomas say, "Will you carry me?" There was a pause. Then the Viscount picked his brother's son up off the cold floor of the corridor and carried him toward the nursery stairs, and Thomas put his head on the man's shoulder in the uncalculating way of a child who has decided that this is where his head belongs, and the carved horse was still in his hand. And the 2 of them went up the stairs and out of sight. She did not go out. She stood in the gap of her door and watched them go. And then she sat on the edge of her bed and looked at her hands for a long time. In the morning, the letter was not in the hall post. She did not know whether it had been sent or taken. She did not ask. Lady Paxton came to find her at noon. The drawing room was being arranged for the evening's small gathering, a post-dinner assembly that Lady Paxton had organized around the Fiernez last evening at Caldwell, and Cecily was crossing from the library to the stairs when Lady Paxton appeared at the end of the corridor with the expression of a woman who has been waiting for an appropriate moment and has decided this is it. "Miss Vane," she said pleasantly. Cecily stopped. "My lady, I wonder if you might take a moment." It was not truly a question. They stood together in the corridor with the sounds of the household moving around them, and Lady Paxton looked at Cecily with the clear, considering expression of a woman who has managed other women most of her adult life and has learned to be accurate about it. "You are a charity case from Derbyshire," Lady Paxton said, in the same pleasant tone she used for everything, which was the most precise thing about her. "I engaged you because you were suitable and available, and Thomas needed someone. I do not regret that decision. You have been conscientious, and the boy is calmer for your presence, and I have not found a single thing in your conduct to fault. Still, I would ask you not to mistake my nephew's courtesy for something that it is not. He is a man of good manners. Good manners are not a declaration. Do not mistake courtesy for permanence." Cecily looked at her for a moment. "I understand," she said. "Good." Lady Paxton straightened a fold in her sleeve with the small practiced gesture of a woman who has delivered difficult things and prefers to close them neatly. "Then we understand each other." She went past Cecily toward the drawing room, and Cecily stood alone in the corridor and breathed, once, carefully, through her nose. She went and found Thomas and told him that the evening gathering would be loud and that he should sleep through it if he could, and she tucked the carved horse into his coat pocket for safekeeping, because he always slept better when he knew where it was. She kissed his forehead and went to her room and changed into her better dress, because she did not know what the evening would require of her, and she preferred to be ready for it. The drawing room gathered at 9. There were perhaps 15 people in the room. The Fiernez had come, along with 3 neighboring families included at Lady Paxton's invitation, the estate's clergyman, and Mr. Ashworth standing near the door with the expression of a man who has done his duty and now wants to go home. Lady Paxton had arranged the room so that the central chairs faced the fireplace, and she had placed Dorothea Fierne in the best of the central chairs, and Dorothea's pale blue gown caught the candlelight in the way that gowns designed for exactly this purpose catch candlelight, precisely and intentionally. Cecily stood near the far window. Not a servant's position, but not a guest's position either. She had learned the geometry of rooms like this one. She knew how to occupy the space available to her without apologizing for it. Lady Paxton was speaking, pleasantly, to Mrs. Fierne, and her voice had the particular warmth of a woman who is approaching a sentence she has been composing for some time. The Viscount came in late. He came in from the hall door rather than the garden door, still in his evening coat, but with his cravat slightly looser than it had been at dinner, which suggested he had paused somewhere before entering the room. He took in the gathering in the 3 seconds it took him to cross the threshold. He looked at Dorothea. He looked at his aunt. He looked at Cecily, near the window in her better dress, with her hands quiet at her sides. He crossed the room. He did not cross it quickly. He walked at the measured pace of a man who has decided what he is going to do and is not in any particular hurry to be stopped before he does it. And the guests in the room moved out of his way without quite registering why they were doing so. Lady Paxton's voice slowed. Dorothea's fan stilled. He stopped beside Cecily, not facing the room, facing her. She looked at him. She could not tell what her face was doing. She hoped it was level. He said to the room, without raising his voice, "I must ask for a moment's indulgence." The room went quiet. He said, There has been some uncertainty about the standing of Miss Vane in this household. I would like to resolve it." Lady Paxton said, "Edward." Her voice was still pleasant, barely. He said, "Miss Vane remains at Caldwell Park at my invitation, as my future wife." The room did not gasp. It simply did the thing that rooms do when something irrevocable has been said, which is to rearrange itself around the fact of it. 3 people looked at Lady Paxton. 2 people looked at Dorothea Fearn, who was looking at her fan with the expression of a woman who had suspected this might happen, and had decided, before this evening, how she would receive it. She received it with grace. She folded her fan closed with a small click, and looked toward the window, and then looked away. Lady Paxton set her teacup down. The sound of it was very exact in the silence. The Viscount turned back to Cecily. She looked at him. She was very careful with her breathing. He said in a low voice that the room could not quite reach, "You wrote me a letter." She said, "I did. I have not read it." She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "I wrote it before I had all the information." Something moved in his face that was not quite a smile and was not quite grief, and was, she understood, probably the closest he came to either. He said, "I should like to hear the corrected version." From across the room, from the far doorway where Mrs. Gould had appeared to see what the altered tone of the gathering meant, there was a small pale shape in nightclothes standing on the bottom step of the nursery stairs with the carved horse in his hand and his eyes wide open. Thomas had not slept through it after all. Mrs. Gould put her hand on the boy's shoulder and turned him gently back up the stairs before anyone else noticed. Cecily noticed. She noticed in the way she noticed everything in that house by now, by feel, by the specific quality of air that changed when Thomas moved through it. She thought, "He will be all right." She thought, "We will be all right." The Viscount offered her his arm, and she took it. They stood together near the window, not speaking, while the room settled around them, and the candles burned, and outside on the park the October dark pressed its cold face against the glass. By Christmas, she was Viscountess Caldwell, in a ceremony attended by her brother Charles, who cried with a thoroughness that suggested he had been holding it for months, and by Thomas, who did not cry, but stood very straight in his good coat, and watched the whole proceeding with the seriousness of someone performing an important function. Lady Paxton attended with good grace. She was a woman who had been confidently wrong, and she was also a woman who knew when to close a chapter and begin the next one. Dorothea Fearn sent a card of congratulation that was brief and correctly worded, and that Cecily kept because she thought it had probably been difficult to write, and the effort deserved to be acknowledged. Winter came in earnest the week after, and the park whitened, and the house turned inward the way houses do in January, gathering its warmth toward the center. 3 months after that, on an evening in February, when the snow was falling again in the slow, considering way of late-season snow, Cecily was sitting in what had been the morning room and was now her sitting room, reading by the fire, when she became aware that someone was at the pianoforte. The pianoforte had been moved from the nursery at Michaelmas. She had not asked for it. It had simply appeared one morning in the corner of her sitting room. And Mrs. Gould, when asked, had said that the Viscount had ordered it moved because the nursery floor was cold and the sitting room had a better fire. Someone was playing a slow air. Badly. With the specific and earnest inaccuracy of a person who has learned a piece of music by listening to it many times and asking someone else to show them the notes. She set her book down. The Viscount was at the pianoforte, with his long back to her and his hands on the keys with the careful attention of a man doing something more difficult than it appeared. He played the piece through once, faltered at the third measure, backed up 2 bars, played it again. He knew it well enough that she could hear what he was attempting. She recognized it from the nursery, from the months before he had known she was playing it, from the doorway he had stood in without announcing himself. He had learned it. He played it through a second time more cleanly. And she laughed. She had not meant to. It came out of her before she could choose it. A genuine sound, warm and unguarded, and she pressed her hand to her mouth for a moment. But it was too late, and she would not have recalled it anyway. He stopped playing. He turned on the bench to look at her, and his expression was so nearly amused and so carefully restrained that it was, she thought, the funniest thing she had ever seen. He said, "I have been practicing for 6 weeks." She said, "I know." She did not know. She was only now realizing she should have known. It was very good. It was not very good. No, she agreed. It was not. It was lovely. He looked at her for a moment in the firelight, with the snow falling outside the window, and the house quiet above them, Thomas long asleep, and the carved horse on the mantelpiece where she had put it last autumn so that it would not be lost. The pale apple wood catching the glow of the fire, steady and unremarkable, and exactly where it was supposed to be. He said, "Cecily," her given name, the first time he had used it. She heard it arrive in the room like something that had been a long time in transit, passing through too many countries and one bad winter before finally reaching its destination. She said, "Yes." He said nothing further. He did not need to. The fire burned. The snow fell. On the mantelpiece, the small carved horse stood in the light with its plain, pale face, and the house held its warmth, and the room was very quiet, and the world outside was patient and cold, and eventually, very slowly, giving way. If any moment in this story moved you, leave a word for it below. Thank you for staying until the end.